Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, everything takes a dark and unexpected turn when Sam is suddenly accused of a crime she never committed. What starts as a quiet life on a peaceful farm quickly spirals into fear, confusion, and injustice as the police arrest her based on planted evidence. Alone in the interrogation room, Sam faces the terrifying possibility of losing everything: her freedom, her reputation, and her future. But just as hope seems completely out of reach, James and Diep step in with crucial evidence that could change the course of her fate. Stay with us until the end to witness how the truth finally comes to light. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The police station felt colder than usual that night, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the silence hanging in the meeting room. Sam sat alone on one side of the metal table, her hands clasped tightly together, wrists still marked red from the handcuffs that had only just been removed. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly, making her head ache, but she didn't dare look away. Every sound felt amplified: the scrape of a chair, the hum of electricity, the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. She still couldn't understand how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Just a few hours earlier, she had been at her small farm, tending to the rows of vegetables, thinking about nothing more serious than whether the weather would turn cold that night. Now, she was sitting in a police station, labeled a suspect, her entire life flipped upside down. The door opened, and two officers walked in. Their expressions were professional, unreadable. One of them placed a file on the table and opened it slowly, page by page, as if dragging out the moment on purpose. "Sam," the officer said calmly, "we have evidence suggesting illegal substances were found on your property. You need to cooperate." Her heart dropped. "I told you," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay composed. "That doesn't belong to me. I've never seen it before. I don't even know what it is." The officer didn't respond immediately. He simply studied her face, as if trying to measure whether fear could be confused with guilt. Sam felt her chest tighten. She had never been good at defending herself with words, and now that weakness felt like a crime. Meanwhile, across town, James was pacing back and forth in his living room. His phone was pressed to his ear, his brows furrowed so tightly it looked painful. "They arrested her," Diep said on the other end of the line, her voice urgent. "They took Sam straight from the farm. She's being framed, James. I'm sure of it." James stopped pacing. "What about the footage?" he asked immediately. "I have it," Diep replied without hesitation. "The security camera behind the storage shed. Someone was there last night, before the police raid. It wasn't Sam." James exhaled sharply, anger and relief colliding in his chest. "Then we don't have time to waste. We take it to the station. Now." At the farm, the late afternoon sun had already dipped low, casting long shadows over the once peaceful land. The place still looked normal from the outside. The trees standing tall, leaves rustling softly in the wind. But inside, everything had changed. Drawers were left open. Tools lay scattered where officers had tossed them aside. The sense of safety Sam had built with her own hands had been ripped apart in minutes. Diep stood near the entrance, staring at the mess with clenched fists. She replayed the memory again and again in her head. How the police had arrived suddenly. How Sam had frozen in confusion. How the white powder had appeared as if from nowhere. It was too clean, Diep muttered to herself. Too convenient. James arrived moments later, his car stopping abruptly in front of the gate. He stepped out, scanning the area instinctively, as if expecting the culprit to still be lurking somewhere nearby. "She's still inside?" he asked. "No," Diep replied. "They took her already." James nodded once. "Then we go straight to Lee." Back at the station, Sam sat through another round of questions. Her answers were the same every time, simple, honest, unchanging. But she could feel the doubt pressing in from all sides. The officers weren't cruel, but their skepticism was heavy, like a weight on her shoulders. "Do you have any enemies?" one of them asked. Sam blinked, stunned by the question. "Enemies? No. I live alone. I don't cause trouble. I barely even leave the farm." The officer exchanged a glance with his colleague. Sam noticed it, and her stomach twisted. Outside the interrogation room, James and Diep hurried through the corridor. Diep clutched her phone tightly, the video ready to play at a moment's notice. James walked slightly ahead, his jaw set, his mind racing through every possible outcome. If they dismissed the evidence, if they were already convinced of Sam's guilt, if they were too late. They stopped in front of a closed door. James knocked firmly. A moment later, the door opened, revealing Lee standing inside his office. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. The moment he saw James and Diep, his expression shifted from surprise to guarded concern. "What is it?" Lee asked. "This isn't a good time." "It has to be," James said, stepping forward. "You arrested the wrong person." Lee's gaze sharpened. "That's a serious accusation." "And we wouldn't make it lightly," Diep added, holding up her phone. "We have proof." Lee hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in." The office was dim, papers spread across the desk in disorganized stacks. Lee gestured for them to sit, but neither James nor Diep did. Diep pressed play on the video immediately. The screen lit up. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. It showed the side of Sam's storage shed late at night. A figure appeared, hood pulled low, moving cautiously. The timestamp confirmed it was hours before the police raid. The person glanced around, then disappeared behind the shed, re-emerging moments later with nothing in their hands. James pointed at the screen. "Sam was inside her house at that time. I can confirm that." Lee leaned closer, his expression tightening. He watched the clip again, then again, slower this time. "Do you know who that is?" he asked. "No," Diep said. "But it proves one thing. Sam didn't put that substance there." Silence filled the room. Lee straightened up, his jaw tense. He rubbed his temple briefly, then reached for the phone. "Bring Sam back to the main room," he said into it. "Immediately." Minutes later, Sam was escorted into the office. Her eyes widened when she saw James and Diep standing there. "James?" she whispered, disbelief flooding her voice. "You're not alone," James said firmly, meeting her gaze. "We're here." Diep stepped closer to Sam and gently placed a hand on her arm. "We found something," she said softly. You just need to stay strong. Lee turned the screen toward Sam. Watch this. As the video played, Sam covered her mouth, tears spilling over. She shook her head again and again. I knew it, she sobbed. I knew someone set me up. Lee exhaled slowly, his face grim. This changes things, he admitted, but we still need to verify it. Sam's heart pounded, but for the first time since the nightmare began, a small spark of hope flickered inside her chest. Justice hadn't arrived yet, but it was finally moving. The verification process stretched on far longer than anyone had anticipated, turning minutes into something heavier, something that pressed down on the chest. Sam sat on the cold bench outside Lee's office, her posture stiff, her back straight, as if discipline alone could keep her from falling apart. Her fingers trembled uncontrollably, twisting together, nails digging into her own skin, just to remind herself she was still awake, still breathing. The hallway felt endless. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting pale reflections on the tiled floor. Officers passed by now and then, their footsteps echoing sharply, each sound making Sam flinch. Every time a door opened, her heart jumped violently, hope surging for half a second before crashing back down when it wasn't her name being called. James leaned against the wall a few steps away, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hadn't sat down once. His jaw was clenched, eyes fixed on the closed office door, as if sheer willpower could force it open. He blamed himself more than anyone else. If he had paid closer attention, if he had noticed sooner that something was wrong around the farm, Sam would never have been dragged into this nightmare. Diep paced back and forth in slow, measured steps. She tried to stay calm, but anger simmered beneath the surface. The image of Sam being handcuffed replayed in her mind again and again. It hadn't felt like a normal arrest. It had felt rushed, almost scripted. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted Sam to be taken away. Finally, after what felt like hours, the office door opened. Lee stepped out, his expression serious, but different now. The sharp edge of suspicion had softened into something closer to concern. "Sam," he said, voice firm but controlled. "Please come inside." Her legs felt weak as she stood, knees trembling. James moved instinctively closer, ready to catch her if she stumbled. Diep placed a steadying hand on Sam's back, guiding her forward. Inside the office, another officer sat at a desk with a laptop open, several files stacked neatly beside it. The room felt heavier than before, the air thick with unspoken tension. Lee gestured for Sam to sit across from him. "We've reviewed the footage you provided," Lee began, folding his hands together multiple times. Sam nodded silently, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "We cross-checked the timestamp with patrol logs," Lee continued. "We also verified phone location data." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Sam's breath caught in her throat. "At the time the individual entered your property," Lee said, "your phone was located inside your house. You were not near the storage shed." Sam's eyes widened. "In addition," the second officer added, turning the laptop slightly toward them, "we ran fingerprint analysis on the container found during the search." Sam leaned forward without realizing it, None of the fingerprints match yours. The words hit her like a wave. For a moment, Sam couldn't process what she was hearing. Her mind struggled to catch up, as if afraid to believe it too quickly. Then it all came crashing down at once. She gasped, hands flying to her mouth as sobs broke free from her chest. Her shoulders shook violently as the fear she had been holding in finally released. "So, I'm free?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Lee nodded. "You are officially cleared of all suspicion. You're free to go." Diep rushed to Sam's side, wrapping her arms around her tightly. Sam cried openly now, no longer trying to be strong. James stood frozen for a moment, relief flooding through him. But beneath it, something darker burned. Rage. Someone had done this on purpose, and they almost succeeded. Lee watched them quietly before speaking again. "This case doesn't end here," he said. "Someone deliberately planted evidence on your property. That means there's a bigger picture." James lifted his gaze. "Then you know this wasn't random." Lee nodded. "Exactly. Sam wasn't the target. She was the tool." Outside the station, the night air felt strangely unreal. Sam stepped out slowly, as if expecting someone to stop her at any second and drag her back inside. Neon lights reflected off wet pavement, blurring in her tear-filled vision. I thought my life was finished," she said quietly, voice hoarse. "In that room, I kept imagining prison. I kept thinking no one would believe me." Diep squeezed her hand firmly. "We believed you, and we weren't going to stop." James looked at Sam, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I should have protected you better." Sam shook her head. "You showed up. That's more than enough." Still, something inside her had shifted. The farm, once her safe world, no longer felt untouchable. Innocence, she realized, didn't protect you from being crushed. The following morning, Lee gathered his team in the briefing room. Maps, photos, and reports covered the screen behind him. This was a calculated setup, Lee said. The suspect knew police procedure and timing. They wanted a quick arrest, minimal questioning. One officer frowned. Could this be linked to the other cases? Lee didn't answer immediately. Yes, that's our strongest lead. Back at the farm, Sam walked slowly through the yard. James and Diep followed a few steps behind, giving her space. Sunlight spilled over the fields, birds chirping as if nothing had happened. But the damage was still there. Open drawers, disturbed soil, the lingering feeling of violation. Sam stopped near the storage shed, her chest tightening. I don't feel safe here anymore, she admitted quietly. Every sound makes me panic. James spoke without hesitation. Then you won't be alone. She turned to him, surprised. Stay with us, he said, at least until this is over. Diep nodded. You shouldn't have to carry this by yourself. Sam hesitated. Independence had always defined her. But now, exhaustion weighed heavier than pride. That afternoon, Lee arrived at the farm, not in uniformed authority, but with a rare look of humility. I owe you an apology, he said. We acted too fast. Sam met his gaze steadily. I just want whoever did this to be stopped. They will be, Lee replied. We're close. As days passed, the investigation tightened. Traffic cameras caught a vehicle circling the farm late at night before the raid. The plates were linked to an old network, one Lee recognized immediately. James began connecting his own dots, quietly pulling threads from past encounters. One night, he returned home with a grim look. This wasn't about drugs, he said to Diep. It was about pressure, about sending a message. Sam overheard from the doorway. Instead of fear, anger ignited within her. "They tried to destroy me," she said firmly. "I won't hide anymore." James looked at her, concern heavy in his eyes. "Standing up means danger." She nodded. "So does silence." Lee called later that evening. "We identified the person behind it," he said. "Arrest is coming soon." Sam stood beneath the night sky after the call ended, stars faint but steady above her. She'd been dragged through fear, humiliation, and despair. But she had survived. This time, she knew the truth, and she would never let it be buried again.